Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe, hit the bell, like, comment, and share.
It began on a night that didn't quite belong to time. The stars had flickered strangely, dimming as if the universe had paused to take a breath. The crickets outside hummed in broken rhythm, and somewhere in the quiet belly of space, a single pulse of light drifted backward, erasing a name that had once belonged to someone very tired of being known. Rick stood in the half-light of his garage, staring at the small glass bottle in his hand. It wasn't large, not even remarkable, just a little vial filled with something that glowed faintly blue, like a dream remembered at dawn. He'd been working on it for months, though he couldn't remember when the idea first came to him. Maybe it had been after another drink or another goodbye. Or maybe it had been waiting in him all along, an old ache trying to become an invention. He whispered to it softly, the way one might speak to a sleeping child. "You'll make it quiet again, won't you?" The vial didn't answer, only hummed, almost kindly. His eyes, lined with exhaustion, caught the shimmer of its light, and for a brief moment he saw his reflection. Older than he remembered, lonelier than he liked to admit. Outside, the night deepened. It wasn't the kind of darkness that frightened. It was gentle, padded, slow. The kind that wraps around a man who's spent too many nights trying to outthink the weight of his own heart. The stars above blinked unevenly, and Rick looked up at them through the garage window. "Guess you're tired too," he muttered. "You know, sometimes we forget that geniuses like him are just people trying to make sense of noise, people who build machines to answer questions they can't put into words." That night, Rick wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a rebel or a god or a legend. He was just a man standing under a ceiling of cold light, wondering if erasing his sadness would make him disappear too. Before we go any further, we want you to know we truly love you for being here. The story you're about to hear isn't just Rick's. It's about anyone who's ever felt the ache of distance, the wish to start over, the strange comfort of a quiet night. Wherever you are, whoever you are, thank you for listening. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Rick turned back to the vial. On his workbench lay scattered notes, diagrams that spiraled into poetry, equations that dissolved into questions like, what if forgetting is a kind of forgiveness? The air smelled faintly of ozone and burnt toast. The lights flickered. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. There were voices in his head, echoes from somewhere softer, a little girl's laugh, a promise half kept, the sound of wind in a backyard swing. He pushed the memories aside, but they clung to him like static. For a man who had seen infinite universes, it was strange how one memory, one version of home, could still hurt the most. The vial began to hum louder, responding to the warmth of his hand. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Rick frowned. "Don't get sentimental on me now," he said, though his voice trembled just enough to betray the truth, that even he wasn't sure if he wanted it to work. He connected the vial to a small device, a web of glowing circuits shaped like a clock that had forgotten how to count. The machine whirred softly as if waking from a long sleep. Its light spilled across the floor, painting the shadows gold. And then something shifted. The stars outside seemed to flicker in rhythm with the heartbeat of the vial. Rick froze. A ripple passed through the air, subtle but enough to make the dust on his shelves tremble. It was as if the universe had sighed. He stepped back, watching, waiting. On one of the monitors nearby, numbers began to vanish, replaced by empty spaces. The machine was erasing something, but what he couldn't tell. Maybe a coordinate, maybe a memory, maybe his own reflection in time. He laughed softly, almost to himself. "You really did it, didn't you, old man?" he said, though there was no pride in it. just a kind of wonder that bordered on sorrow. Outside, the sky dimmed a little more. A child in another house might have looked up and thought a cloud had passed. But if you listened carefully, if you really listened, you could hear the faintest whisper between the stars, like someone's name being gently rewritten. Beth's name had not yet been spoken that night. She was still somewhere in the timeline, a child dreaming without knowing her father was awake and rewriting the edges of her future. Later, when she'd ask about the missing stars, Rick would shrug and say something about cosmic dust. But tonight, he stood in silence, the vial glowing brighter in his palm. He thought of her then, not as the woman she would become, but as the little girl who once believed the stars could talk back. He'd promised her once that he'd show her how they sang. He never did. Some promises dissolve quietly, like sugar in tea. Others echo through a man's bones until the end of time. The machine flickered again. Rick took another drink from the flask on his desk and winced. "Guess it's working," he whispered. "Guess that's something." His words hung in the air, heavy and warm. He sat down on the old stool, resting his elbows on the table. His mind wandered, not to other dimensions this time, but to a quiet kitchen years ago. The smell of burnt toast, the sound of a child's laughter, the soft hum of a lullaby he hadn't meant to hum. He reached for the vial again, and for a moment he almost stopped it. Almost. But something in him, that familiar ache, that scientist's pride mixed with the loneliness of a father who'd failed too often, told him to let it finish. The light swelled, flooding the room. He closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, he was nowhere, suspended between what was and what could never be. Then the glow dimmed. The machine powered down. The stars outside steadied again. He looked at the monitors. The erased numbers were gone for good. He didn't know what he'd lost. Maybe a memory, maybe a moment, maybe just the name the stars had whispered when they still remembered who he was. Rick leaned back, exhaling. The garage was quiet now. Too quiet. Even the hum of his inventions seemed to fade, as though the universe itself had fallen asleep. He could hear his own breathing, slow and uneven. He reached for a small recorder on his desk, pressed the red button, and spoke softly, almost to himself. "If anyone finds this, don't wake me. I'm not gone. Just resting somewhere in the space between." He left the recorder running and turned off the lights. For a long moment he stood there in the dark, watching the faint glow from the vial fade to nothing. Then, almost tenderly, he placed it in a drawer and closed it. Outside, a single shooting star crossed the sky. Quiet, unhurried, like an afterthought. Somewhere in the stillness, the night remembered his name again, but only for a second. Rick smiled faintly, his silhouette soft against the window. He whispered something the stars might have heard, though no one else ever would. And for the first time in a very long while, he let himself rest. Not as a genius, not as a traveler, but as a father who tried, in his own strange way, to make the night a little quieter for the ones he loved. The air around him settled, the machine slept, the stars blinked once more, and the world exhaled. Somewhere, far away, a little girl dreamed beneath that same sky, dreaming of a door that would one day open, and of the light that would spill through it, soft as forgiveness, and in the dark, the universe hummed like a lullaby no one remembered how to finish. Morning came slow, like a dream, reluctant to wake. The air outside Rick's house shimmered faintly, carrying that quiet stillness that follows a strange night. The grass glistened with dew that hadn't been there a moment before. A single leaf hung frozen mid-fall for the briefest breath, then drifted down as though the universe had remembered its rhythm again. Inside, Beth waited. She was small then, maybe 7, maybe 8, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-eaten sandwich beside her, peanut butter and something unidentifiable, smeared unevenly, a combination only a child would invent. Her legs swung idly beneath the chair, not touching the floor. On the table, a clock ticked with patient indifference. She'd been counting the seconds between each tick, whispering softly to herself. 1, 2, 3, as if her voice might make time move faster. The door to the garage stayed closed. It always did. Sometimes she thought she heard music behind it, low, metallic, almost sad. Other times it was just silence, deep and heavy, the kind that made the air around her chest feel thick. Her mother had once told her that Rick was busy saving the universe. But even as a child, Beth had wondered why saving the universe meant missing dinner so often. She pushed the sandwich away and drew something on a napkin, a shaky star with long, uneven rays. She gave it a smile and wrote, "Hi, Dad," under it in crooked letters. The ink bled a little. Then she folded the napkin neatly and placed it on the table's edge, where she knew he'd see it if he ever came inside. The sun shifted through the blinds, cutting the kitchen into stripes of gold and shadow. A faint hum came from the garage. Her eyes lifted. She wanted to run to the door, to knock, to ask if he'd like to eat with her. But she didn't. She had learned that waiting quietly was the closest thing to being close to him. Sometimes, when she was sure no one was listening, Beth talked to the refrigerator. It hummed back kindly. "Do you think he misses me?" she asked it once. The fridge made a sound that could almost be mistaken for a sigh. She nodded. "Yeah, I think so too." Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill. It tilted its head at her and chirped once before flying away. She followed it with her eyes, tracing its path until it vanished into the trees. When she looked back, the napkin was gone. Just like that. No sound, no breeze, only absence, as if the universe had quietly taken note of her small message and delivered it elsewhere. In the garage, Rick sat at his workbench, holding that same napkin between 2 fingers. The ink had smudged, and a faint peanut butter fingerprint marked the edge. His jaw tightened. He didn't remember hearing the door open, but things like that happened sometimes. The world slipping through itself. He read the words again. "Hi, Dad." 2 words, simple, uneven. His throat burned in a way that had nothing to do with the whiskey bottle beside him. He placed the napkin beside the vial, still dark from the night before. For a long while he said nothing, just stared. The hum of the machines became softer, almost respectful. The stars above him, if they could see through the roof, might have noticed how small he looked then. Not the man who built worlds, but the man who forgot how to knock on his daughter's door. Beth waited until the sunlight touched her arm. "He'll come soon," she whispered, more to the air than to herself. The clock ticked on. She traced her finger over the table's grain, pretending each line led somewhere better, somewhere where he smiled more easily. At some point, her mother called her to bed. Beth obeyed, though her eyes lingered on the garage door. She left it a little open this time, just in case the light wanted to sneak through. Later that night, Rick came inside. The house was quiet. He moved through it like a ghost, stepping around the toys she'd left scattered on the carpet. One of them, a small plastic horse with a broken leg, caught his eye. He bent down, picked it up, and stared at it. For a moment, he almost fixed it. Almost. Instead, he placed it on the table beside the folded napkin and poured himself another drink. He looked toward Beth's room. The door was half open. He could hear her breathing, soft, steady. He leaned against the wall, just outside, and listened. That sound had a rhythm the whole multiverse couldn't replicate. He whispered something under his breath, not quite words, more like the ghost of an apology that had waited too long. He wanted to tell her about the vial, about the stars that had flickered, about how he thought he'd made things better. But what kind of father explains cosmic regret to a sleeping child? Instead, he just stood there, watching the crack of light under her door fade as she shifted in her bed. Beth dreamed of a room full of stars. Not far off ones, close ones, bright and humming. In the dream, her father stood in the middle of them, his face hidden, his hands glowing faintly blue. She called to him, but her voice came out as light, not sound. He turned toward her, almost smiling, and said, "You'll understand someday." She didn't know what he meant, but it felt like truth, so she nodded and let the dream dissolve. In the morning, she woke to find the napkin back on the table, folded differently this time, like a little star. She held it in her hands and smiled. Maybe it was her mom, maybe magic, maybe both. Children rarely need proof for what they already believe. Rick watched from the garage window as she ate breakfast. He saw her unfold the napkin and laugh softly. That sound filled the space between them for a heartbeat, long enough for him to smile without realizing it. Then the moment passed, as all moments do. He turned away, back to his tools, his silence. But the smile stayed a little longer than usual. Later that day, he tried to build something small. A trinket, maybe a gift, a memory crystal shaped like a locket. But the circuitry kept rejecting his commands. The machine pulsed red over and over. "Guess it doesn't like sentiment," he muttered. He threw the tool down, but softly. He was tired of breaking things. Beth spent the afternoon outside, lying on the grass, watching the sky. She pretended the clouds were doors, opening and closing for travelers. "He's probably out there," she whispered, "fixing something important." And maybe he was. Maybe he was fixing the part of himself that still couldn't say he missed her. As dusk fell, she drew constellations in the dirt, lines that connected stars only she could see. One looked like a bottle, another like a door. She smiled, her small fingers tracing the sky's map. That night, the stars shone a little brighter. The same ones that had dimmed before seemed to find their light again, as if forgiving him. Rick noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. He stood by the window, the empty vial on the counter beside him. Outside, Beth's laughter echoed faintly, the sound of a child who didn't know she'd already become her father's reason to keep trying. He whispered again, softly this time, almost afraid the universe might hear. "Don't stop waiting for me, kid. I'm still finding the way back." Beth, half asleep in her bed, stirred at the sound of his voice drifting through her dreams. She smiled, and though she wouldn't remember it in the morning, she whispered back, "I know." And somewhere between the stars and the silence, their words met. Two tiny sparks crossing in the dark, small enough to be missed, strong enough to outlast the night. Years drifted the way light fades through a dusty window. Slowly, tenderly, without warning, Beth grew older, though the world around her seemed caught in the same quiet pause. The house changed in small ways. Paint peeled, furniture aged, the fridge hummed the same lullaby every night. And yet, somewhere in that familiar stillness, new sounds began to appear. A mechanical hum, a low melodic pulse. The garage had started to dream. It began one evening when the sky looked too heavy to hold itself up. Rain pressed softly against the windows, and Beth, now a teenager, wandered into the garage without knocking. Rick was there, of course, surrounded by cables, half-finished gadgets, and that endless smell of solder and stale coffee. He didn't look up at first. He rarely did. But she didn't leave this time. "Does it ever stop?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. "What?" His tone was gruff, distracted. "The noise. The building. Everything." He paused, wrench in hand. For a second, the question broke through the haze. Then he shrugged. "Not if you're doing it right." Beth smiled faintly. "Maybe I don't want to do it right." Rick glanced up then. His eyes were tired. Not the kind that came from lack of sleep, but from too much remembering. "And you'll probably be happier than most," he said, and went back to his work. Beth took a slow step forward. The air was warm from the machines, filled with a soft electrical hum. She saw something glowing in the corner. A small orb suspended in a web of wires, pulsing like a heartbeat. It shifted colors with every pulse, blue, gold, violet. What's that? Rick hesitated. It's called the somnisphere, he said finally. Records patterns of thought. Dreams, maybe? Dreams? He shrugged again. Depends on how you define them. Beth stared, transfixed. Does it work? Rick chuckled, low and dry. It dreams more than I do. The words hung in the air, soft and accidental. Beth felt them settle somewhere deep inside her chest. She looked at the orb again. Can I see? He hesitated, then waved a hand. Go ahead. She approached carefully, her reflection shimmering across its surface. When she leaned close enough, the colors shifted again. And then suddenly an image bloomed inside the light. It was faint, like a reflection caught in fog. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, laughing as she sat on a porch step. A man's shadow fell beside her. She couldn't see the face, but she knew the posture. The way the shoulders curved, the hands never quite still. Is that me? Beth whispered. Rick didn't answer. His jaw tightened. The image faded as quickly as it had appeared, dissolving into a soft haze of color. The machine hummed like it was sighing in its sleep. Why did it show that? She asked. Rick rubbed the back of his neck. It remembers what you bring to it. Thought patterns, emotional residue, something like that. It's not exact. It just knows. Beth nodded, though she didn't really understand. She stood there a little longer, watching the light shift and shimmer. It felt alive, not in a frightening way, but in a quiet, curious way, like it was listening. That night, after she'd gone to bed, Rick stayed in the garage long after the machines should have cooled. The somnisphere pulsed faintly in the dark. He poured another drink, staring at it the way one might stare at an old photograph. He whispered something, a word, maybe a name, and the light brightened almost eagerly. For a moment the air shimmered. A faint voice echoed back. It wasn't clear, not quite human, but it said something that sounded like home. Rick's hand trembled. He reached toward it, but stopped just short. Don't, he muttered to himself. Not again, but the sphere didn't stop. It flickered faster now, glowing gold, and within it appeared another image, a woman's silhouette, laughing softly as she poured coffee into a chipped mug. The image wavered, then dissolved. Rick closed his eyes. Damn thing doesn't know when to quit. The next morning, Beth returned. Rick was asleep at his workbench, a soldering iron still in his hand. The somnisphere glowed faintly, like a candle trying not to go out. She didn't wake him. She just stood there, watching him sleep. The lines on his face softer now, the weariness almost gentle. She looked at the sphere again. What are you dreaming about? She whispered. It pulsed once, blue, as if answering. Over the next few weeks, the machine became part of her daily ritual. She'd stop by before school just to look. The colors changed, depending on her mood. Pink when she was happy, grey when she wasn't. Rick noticed, though he never said much. Sometimes he'd add new components, small modifications that made the lights dance in patterns she could almost recognize. One evening, Beth sat in front of the somnisphere, tracing her finger across its glass surface. Does it ever show the future? She asked. Rick didn't look up from his tools. Maybe, but the future's just memory that hasn't happened yet. She smiled faintly. That's the most Rick thing you've ever said. Don't quote me on it, he said, but his lips twitched with something close to affection. Later that night, Beth dreamed again. In the dream, she was standing inside the somnisphere. The air shimmered like light underwater. All around her floated pieces of memory, her mother's laughter, her father's voice, a million tiny moments suspended in gold. At the center of it all stood Rick, holding the glowing vial from long ago. Why do you keep it? She asked him in the dream. He looked at it, then at her. Because some things aren't meant to be forgotten, he said softly, even when they hurt. When she woke, The morning light was thin and blue. The somnisphere was still humming. On the workbench beside it sat a new object, a small disc engraved with her initials. She picked it up. It was warm to the touch, and when she held it to her ear, she could faintly hear a sound, her own laughter from years ago. Rick entered just then, rubbing his eyes. "You weren't supposed to find that yet." "It's mine?" He nodded awkwardly. "Backup memory, just in case," she smiled. "You made a dream catcher out of science." He rolled his eyes, but there was no irritation in it. "Don't make it sound sentimental." Beth turned the disc in her hand. "Maybe sentimental isn't so bad," Rick didn't answer. He was looking at the somnisphere again. The colors inside had shifted to a deep, calm gold. It looked peaceful, almost human. That evening, after Beth had gone to bed, he sat alone once more. He stared at the orb, then at the small disc she'd taken with her. He wondered if, somewhere in the layers of memory, the universe kept a copy of moments like this. The quiet ones, the unremarkable ones, the ones that made living bearable. He reached out and touched the glass. The light brightened beneath his fingers. A voice, faint, familiar, whispered, "You did enough." For a moment he almost believed it. Beth, half dreaming upstairs, stirred in her sleep. She could hear something through the walls. Not the hum of machinery, but the soft rhythm of her father's breathing. The sound of someone finally resting, if only for a while. Outside, the stars pulsed in slow harmony, as if listening. The somnisphere glowed one last time before dimming, its dream complete and, somewhere between invention and memory, between guilt and love, the quietest version of Rick. Sanchez finally fell asleep. There are certain evenings that feel like they're not entirely part of time, like they slipped through a gap in the universe and decided to linger where the clocks can't find them. That's how the night felt for Beth. The air hung still. The stars trembled as if listening. Somewhere in the house, the quiet hum of one of Rick's unfinished machines vibrated softly, pulsing in rhythm with the faint heartbeat of the walls. She sat in her old bedroom, fingers resting on a faded photograph of her father holding her as a child, his hair less grey, his eyes not yet clouded by endless knowing. She wondered what it must have been like, being loved by a man who could see infinity but still struggled to say goodnight. Rick was many things, a genius, a wanderer, a man broken by brilliance, but he was also a ghost that refused to stop haunting himself. The picture trembled slightly in her hand, not because of the wind, there was no wind, but because sometimes memories shiver when they're about to speak. She closed her eyes, and it began again, the same dream she'd had since childhood. The meadow that stretched forever, and her father sitting beneath a crooked tree, staring up at a green-tinted sky. In the dream, she was always too far to reach him. He'd wave, then point towards something in the distance, a light or a door, or maybe just the shimmer of another universe waiting. She never knew. She'd wake before she got close enough to ask, but tonight, as she drifted near sleep, she felt something different. The air in the room changed, denser yet strangely soft. There was the scent of ozone, faint and metallic, like lightning just before a storm. Then a sound, gentle, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby, hummed through circuits. Beth opened her eyes and he was there. Not the real him, but a projection, Rick's voice woven through a hologram that flickered in and out of phase. His figure was slouched, lab coat wrinkled, eyes sunken but glinting with that old mischief that always hid more pain than anyone realized. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. "Didn't think I'd be showing up like this, huh?" Beth's breath caught. "What is this, some backup version of you?" Rick smirked, though it was a sad sort of smile. "Something like that. Think of it as a message that didn't know when to give up. I left it running in a quantum loop until it found you when you needed it most." "When I needed it most," she echoed. "And you get to decide when that is?" He shrugged. I programmed it with intuition. You got that from me, didn't you? She almost laughed. Intuition? You mean guilt dressed up as science? Rick chuckled. Yeah, maybe that too. There was a long pause, soft, not cold. The kind of silence that fills itself with things unsaid. Beth leaned forward. You always left pieces of yourself behind, gadgets, recordings, clones, whole universes, but never answers. Why? Rick's form shimmered, flickering as though her question strained the stability of his code. Because answers ruin the mystery, he said quietly. And the mystery is the only thing that kept me going. The moment I thought I knew everything, I started breaking things just to see if the pieces could still surprise me. Beth swallowed hard. And what about me? Was I one of those pieces? Rick's voice softened. You were the only thing I didn't want to break. But I still did. That's the curse of being me. Outside, wind finally found its way into the night, brushing against the window pane like the whisper of a long-lost thought. The stars flickered differently now, more awake, more listening. I found your notes, Beth said quietly. The ones under the garage floor, Rick smiled faintly. Ah, the ones with the equations for the synthetic soul project. Yes, you wrote a line that didn't look like code. You said, if she ever reads this, tell her I never stopped trying to fix the thing I broke the most. What did you mean? Rick's projection dimmed slightly, his outline trembling. I meant everything. I meant the universe. I meant myself. But mostly, I meant you. Something inside Beth loosened, the kind of ache that had lived in her bones for years, waiting for a sentence just like that. She stood, stepping closer to the fading light of him, and for a second, just a second, it almost felt like warmth. You know, Rick murmured, voice fading into a static hum. When you were little, you used to build little cardboard spaceships and say you'd find me one day. No matter where I went. Guess you did. Beth smiled through tears. Yeah, I guess I did. The hologram flickered again, weaker now. I left something for you, under the old telescope in the garage. Not a weapon, not a gadget, just something that might help you remember me softer. And then he was gone. The air fell still. The hum of his machines subsided into a kind of peace. Beth stayed awake for a while, not out of fear, but because she didn't want to disturb the quiet. When she finally rose and walked to the garage, the night followed her gently, as though curious about what she would find. The telescope stood where it always had, coated with dust, surrounded by empty beakers and tangled wires. She knelt beside it, tracing her hand along the cold metal. Beneath it, she found a small wooden box, not scientific at all, not Rick's usual work. Inside was a pocket watch, old and gold, its surface etched with faint constellations. When she pressed it open instead of ticking, it played a soft melody, a lullaby she vaguely remembered from her childhood. She could almost hear his voice humming it in the background of her earliest memories, when the stars were still small enough to fit in her hands. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she listened, the music fading slowly, like a heartbeat easing into rest. Beth walked outside then, watch still in hand. The night stretched endlessly overhead, the constellations winking like old friends who had finally come home. Somewhere she thought she could hear a whisper, a voice between the atoms, laughing softly, saying something like, "You did good, kiddo." She smiled faintly. "Good night, Dad." And for the first time in years, her heart didn't ache when she said it. The stars above shimmered as though they heard her. Somewhere, perhaps in another corner of reality, maybe even beyond it, Rick Sanchez sat under a crooked tree, tinkering with the light of universes. And when he looked up, he smiled. Not the bitter smile of a man escaping his pain, but the quiet, proud smile of a father watching his daughter finally find peace. The night folded itself gently around her. The air hummed softly. Everything was still. Somewhere a clock ticked once, then stopped, as if it too decided that time could rest for a while. And in that moment, for Beth, And maybe even for Rick, the universe exhaled. Morning came gently, like the world was afraid to wake her. A pale sunlight poured through the half-open blinds, washing the floor in quiet gold. The air still smelled faintly of ozone and dust, like traces of another world refusing to fade. Beth stirred from the couch where she'd fallen asleep with the pocket watch resting against her chest. It wasn't ticking, it never did, but somehow it pulsed softly, as though mimicking the rhythm of her heartbeat. For a long moment, she didn't move. The melody from the night before still lingered in her mind. It wasn't just sound, it was memory folded into music. Every note felt like a message written between seconds. Maybe that was how her father always meant to speak, through things that lasted longer than words. Outside, the sky was quiet. The grass shimmered with dew. Birds sang without hurry, and the wind carried the faint echo of something older. Something like nostalgia. Beth wrapped her arms around herself and watched the light climb across the garage. It felt different now, like the world had been subtly rearranged in her sleep. She remembered his voice, not the harsh, cynical tone he used to fend off the world, but the softer one, rare, fleeting, the one he used when explaining constellations to her as a child. He'd say things like, "Those stars aren't really up there, Beth. They're memories, hanging light years away, still shining after the moment's gone." Now she understood what he meant. Maybe every choice, every goodbye, every laughter-filled night they shared had its own constellation, still shining even after he'd gone. The thought gave her a strange peace, a heavy one, but peace nonetheless. She stood and walked to the mirror near the door. Her reflection looked different today. Tired, yes, but calmer. The kind of calm that comes when grief starts turning into understanding. She brushed her hair back and whispered to her reflection, "You always said you'd show me the universe, Dad. I think I'm starting to see it." The pocket watch glimmered faintly in her palm. Something about it drew her attention, a fine seam along the edge, almost invisible. Carefully, she pressed her thumb against it, and the watch clicked open again. But this time, the melody didn't play. Instead, a soft blue light bloomed from within, forming a small projection, a series of coordinates floating in the air, accompanied by a voice recording so faint it could almost be mistaken for memory. "Beth," Rick's voice whispered, rough and weary. "If you're hearing this, it means the old man finally did something right. There's something out there. Something I built a long time ago, but never had the nerve to finish. Maybe it's time you saw it." The light flickered, the voice stuttering as though carried across endless dimensions. "Don't think of it as a machine. Think of it as a reflection of who I was before I got lost trying to fix everything." Then silence. Beth exhaled, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "Of course, you leave me a scavenger hunt across the cosmos." But even as she said it, she felt no frustration, just warmth, an ache that wasn't painful anymore. Maybe this was his way of staying connected, of teaching her one last lesson the only way he knew how. She set the watch down on the table, went to the garage, and found the old ship Rick used to patch together between arguments and hangovers. The hull was still dented, the controls dusty, but the smell of engine oil and portal fluid was enough to make her smile. He'd always said the garage wasn't a lab, it was a memory factory. Every broken gadget held a story, every scorch mark a failed miracle. She climbed into the pilot seat. The cushions had faded, the buttons stuck, but when she pressed the ignition, the entire room filled with that low, familiar hum, a sound that felt like home. The ship shook once, lights flickering to life. Beth glanced at the coordinates glowing in the air and entered them manually. The system hesitated for a moment, then beeped in confirmation. A small rift began to form before her, a quiet tear in space, shimmering like liquid glass. She hesitated, Leaving meant stepping into his world, the one that had always taken him from her. But she also knew she couldn't stay. The message wasn't just for discovery. It was an invitation to closure. As the rift widened, she whispered, "Okay, Dad, let's see what you couldn't finish." The ship slipped through the veil like a sigh. On the other side, there was no explosion of color, no disorienting rush, just quiet. The stars looked closer here, vast and patient, and the void shimmered with a faint bluish haze. Beth's hands gripped the console as the ship slowed before a strange object floating in open space, a structure shaped like a spiral, turning endlessly. It looked alive, its edges glowing faintly with starlight. She drifted closer, eyes wide. The spiral pulsed like a heartbeat. As she neared, she saw that it wasn't made of metal. It was composed of thousands of tiny lights, each one orbiting a small crystalline core. In the center floated a single word, projected faintly into the dark. "Remember?" Beth felt her chest tighten. "Is it your memory, Dad?" she whispered. Something stirred. The spiral rotated faster, and from its light, visions began to emerge, soft, hazy memories unfolding like dreams. She saw herself as a child, sitting on Rick's shoulders, laughing as he pointed to constellations that didn't yet exist. She saw him working through nights, muttering equations between sips of whiskey, his eyes tired but alive. She saw moments he never spoke of, his first glimpse of her as a newborn, the look of awe he'd tried so hard to hide. Tears welled in her eyes. "You kept this?" A gentle vibration filled the ship, and Rick's voice returned, soft and fragile. "Memories are the only inventions that last, Beth. I used to think I could outsmart the universe. Turns out all I wanted was for one good thing to survive me." The lights pulsed, then dimmed, as though giving her space to breathe. Beth closed her eyes, letting the silence stretch. She thought about all the years she'd spent trying to understand him, trying to reconcile the genius with the father, the inventor with the man who couldn't say sorry. Maybe this quiet place of light and memory, was his apology. Not spoken, but lived through her. She reached toward the spiral, fingertips grazing the glowing orbs. They flickered, and she felt warmth flood her veins, a quiet hum that wasn't just mechanical. It was emotional, almost alive in that instant. She felt what he must have felt all those years, the weight of creation, the loneliness of knowing too much, and the endless longing for someone to understand. And she did, finally. As she turned the ship away, the spiral began to dissolve, scattering its lights into the darkness like seeds. She watched until the last spark faded. Then softly, she whispered, "I remember." The rift opened again, leading her home. When she landed, the world felt softer. The garage, once cluttered and chaotic, now glowed faintly in the afternoon sun. The pocket watch still sat on the table, the melody silent but alive in her memory. Beth sat beside it and smiled. "You never stopped teaching me, did you?" Outside, a breeze swept through the trees, carrying a faint hum, a sound that might have been the universe laughing softly to itself. Beth leaned back, eyes closing. For the first time, she didn't feel the emptiness of his absence, only the fullness of his presence woven into everything around her. The watch pulsed once more, like a heart saying goodnight, and somewhere, far beyond time and distance, Rick Sanchez looked up from his tools, a faint smile ghosting across his lips, and whispered into the void, "Sleep well, kiddo." The days that followed moved differently, as though time itself had exhaled. The house no longer felt empty, though it was quiet. Every corner seemed to hum faintly with a kind of remembrance. The pocket watch rested on Beth's nightstand, still and silent. But sometimes, when the wind moved through the open window, she could swear it shimmered, just enough to catch her attention. She began spending her mornings in the garage again, not to fix or build, but to listen. Rick had always said machines spoke if you were patient enough to hear them. And though she didn't have his mind for physics or invention, she'd found her own way of hearing. The soft hum of circuits, the creak of metal cooling after long use, the low rhythm of the generator. Together they sounded like breathing, like the world remembering something it didn't want to forget. One afternoon, she found an old tape recorder buried under a pile of wiring. She cleaned it carefully, dust catching on her fingers like fine ash. Inside was a tape, unlabeled, just a faint scrawl of blue ink. Loop 43. She hesitated, then pressed play. There was static first, a crackling of sound that seemed to travel across galaxies. Then Rick's voice, low, tired, but softer than she remembered. Loop 43. Okay, yeah. This one's for Beth. I'm not sure if she'll ever hear it, but that's the point of loops, right? They go on until someone does. Beth froze, every muscle still. I've been thinking, the voice continued. You ever notice how memories age differently? Some fade fast. Others, well, they grow. Like old wine or bad habits. I used to think I could outthink the way memories work. Turns out they're smarter than I am. They wait. They find you when you're ready. A long pause followed. She could hear him tinkering with something in the background, the clink of metal, the sound of a lighter flicking open and shut. I made something, Beth, he said eventually. Something not even the council would understand. A space between spaces, a place that keeps the things we lose, until we're ready to see them again. I don't know if it's heaven, hell, or just leftover math, but I like to think it's where love hides when we're too stupid to recognize it. The tape clicked, then silence. Beth let it play through again and again until she could recite the words by heart. Each time his voice felt closer, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something in between, a quiet presence leaning against the edges of the present moment. That night, she dreamed of that space between spaces. In the dream, it wasn't distant or cosmic. It was a field of soft golden grass that rippled like a sea. The sky above was filled with slow-moving stars, each one pulsing gently, as if breathing. She walked barefoot, the air carrying the faint scent of rain and metal. Somewhere ahead she saw a workbench, a familiar one. Tools scattered, half-finished machines resting in gentle disarray. And sitting beside it, not working, not drinking, but watching the horizon, was her father. He turned as she approached, that same lopsided grin curling his lips. "Took you long enough, kiddo." She wanted to speak, but her voice was caught somewhere between wonder and ache. Rick looked out toward the field again. "You know what this place is?" Beth shook her head. "It's what's left when we finally stop trying to fix everything. Just space for things to exist, for people to be." He glanced at her then, eyes soft. "You always thought I left you because I didn't care. Truth is, I was scared. Scared that if I stayed, you'd see too much of me in yourself." Beth felt tears rise. "Maybe that wouldn't have been a bad thing." Rick chuckled softly. "Yeah, maybe not." He stood, walking toward her. The field around them shimmered like liquid sunlight. "There's something you should know, Beth. You're not the result of my mistakes. You're the proof I still believed in something good." When she reached out to touch him, the dream began to dissolve. The air thinned. His voice grew distant. "Don't look for me in machines anymore," he said as his form faded. "Look for me in the things that stay soft. In light, in laughter, in the quiet after storms." And then she was awake. The morning light filtered through her curtains again, pale and gentle. For a moment, she lay still, the echo of his words lingering in her chest like a soft hum. She turned her head toward the pocket watch. It was open now, though she hadn't touched it. Inside, the faint blue light glowed again, pulsing like a heartbeat. Something had changed. She rose slowly and approached the window. Outside, the sky was brushed with streaks of amber and violet. The world felt alive in a way she hadn't noticed before, as if it had been waiting for her to catch up. Beth held the watch to her ear. No ticking, no melody, just silence, and somehow that silence felt complete. Over the following days, she began writing. Not research notes or formulas. She wasn't him. Instead, she wrote stories, quiet ones, about fathers and daughters who built stars out of cardboard, about forgotten songs that only played when someone remembered them, about people who found peace in the spaces they used to fear. Sometimes she'd talk aloud while she wrote, as though Rick could still hear her. "You'd hate this," she'd tease. No explosions, no quantum theory, just feelings. Lots of feelings, and maybe somewhere out there he laughed. As weeks passed, she started to feel that his story, their story, wasn't about loss at all. It was about translation. How love, when broken apart by time or pride, still finds its way back in another form. In a song, a dream, a flicker of light. One evening, as the sun sank low, she took the ship out again, not to chase the past, but to watch the stars. She drifted above the curve of Earth, where the atmosphere glowed like a sleeping ember. The quiet was enormous but comforting. She opened the pocket watch once more. The blue light filled the cabin. This time, no coordinates, no message, just an image. Her childhood drawing, scanned and preserved in holographic form. Her, Rick, and their cardboard spaceship, with the words, "To the stars, together." Beth smiled, tears warming her eyes. "You kept everything, didn't you?" She pressed her forehead against the glass, gazing out at the horizon where night met day. The stars looked softer now, less distant, more like memories gently burning. "I get it now," she whispered. "You weren't teaching me science. You were teaching me how to wonder." The ship floated in silence. Time stretched thin, and somewhere, maybe just in the folds of her heart, maybe beyond all known universes, Rick's voice returned, faint and fading, but filled with peace. "Wonder's the only thing that makes it all worth it, kiddo." Beth closed her eyes. The pocket watch dimmed, the light fading into a steady golden warmth. She breathed deeply, letting the sound of the stars fill her chest. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was searching anymore. She was home. There are evenings that arrive like a sigh, soft and slow, and carry with them the scent of something remembered. Beth sat by the window that night, watching rain trace delicate lines down the glass. The world outside looked blurred and half-dreamed, every droplet reflecting fragments of light that trembled like tiny universes. The pocket watch sat open beside her, its faint blue glow painting her fingers in soft luminescence. It no longer surprised her when it flickered. It felt alive, like a heart, keeping time in a place beyond sound. She had started to live more quietly now, not in retreat but in rhythm. She worked in the mornings, tended to the house, wrote in the evenings. The chaos that had once defined her father's world was gone, replaced by something gentler, a life that didn't need to be solved. But some nights, like this one, she still felt the pull, the whisper of the unknown pressing against her window pane, asking if she wanted to remember more. It began, as it often did, with a sound, barely audible, like the universe taking a breath. Then, a faint shimmer in the corner of her vision. When she turned, she saw it, a figure standing in the reflection of the window. Not her reflection, but his, Rick. He wasn't clear or solid, just a faint outline of light and memory standing behind her in the reflection. His face was calm. The edges of his form drifted like smoke caught in moonlight. "Hey," Beth whispered, voice breaking softly. He didn't speak, just smiled, a small knowing smile that said everything and nothing at once. Beth blinked, and the image flickered, fading into the rain's reflection. For a moment, she thought it was her mind playing tricks, but then the pocket watch pulsed, steady and deliberate. She felt warmth, spread through the air, the kind that always came before something impossible. "Are you trying to tell me something again?" she asked quietly. The watch clicked open by itself. From within, a soft hum emerged, different this time.
Not a melody, a frequency?
It resonated deep in her bones, the sound both ancient and familiar. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her. When she opened them again, she was no longer in her room. The transition was weightless, seamless. One heartbeat she was in her home. The next, standing in what looked like an endless expanse of stars. The ground beneath her feet shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting constellations she didn't recognize. The air tasted like memory, sweet and electric. She wasn't afraid. She had learned that fear didn't belong here. In the distance stood something she hadn't seen before. A door. It was tall and narrow, floating upright with no walls to hold it, carved from dark metal that seemed to pulse with light. Across its surface ran faint engravings, formulas, symbols, and small doodles, like the ones Rick used to draw in his notebooks when he thought no one was watching. Beth stepped closer. Each footfall rippled through the glass-like floor, sending waves of color across the space. When she reached the door, she hesitated. "I guess this is what you meant by the space between spaces," she murmured. The door opened soundlessly. Inside was a small
Room. Simple, familiar. It
was his old workspace, but quieter, softer. The clutter was gone. The air was warm. A single desk sat near the center, bathed in a pool of golden light. On it rested a stack of papers, a flask, and a photograph. Her, as a child, sitting beside him, both of them covered in paint from some long-forgotten project. Her throat tightened. She reached out and touched the photo, and the room seemed to breathe. The golden light deepened, flickering faintly, and she heard him, his voice, low, distant, but alive. "Beth, if you found this, then you already understand more than I ever did." She turned toward the sound, eyes wide. His voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I used to think intelligence was everything," he said. "That if I could explain the universe, I'd finally be free of it. But understanding isn't freedom. Sometimes it's a cage. His voice paused, softening. "You saw what I couldn't. You let life be beautiful without needing to take it apart." Beth closed her eyes, listening as tears traced quiet paths down her cheeks.
I kept trying to rewrite the story, the voice continued. Every version of me in every universe tried to fix the same wound. But maybe the wound wasn't something to fix. It was something to feel. You taught me that, even when I wasn't there to say it.
The room dimmed, the air trembling with a faint hum. Everything I built, the machines, the portals, the worlds, it was all me trying to find home. Turns out, home was just wherever you kept remembering me kindly. Beth pressed her palm against her heart.
I always did, she whispered, even when I didn't want to. The golden light swelled, bathing the room in a quiet glow. The papers on the desk fluttered, and one drifted toward her. It wasn't a formula or a drawing. It was a letter.
In his handwriting, messy and uneven, the first line read, "To the one thing I never stopped trying to get right." She read it slowly, every word like a heartbeat. It wasn't a scientific confession or an apology. It was something else, something simple. A thank you for staying, for forgiving, for existing in a way he never could. When she finished, the paper dissolved in her hands, turning into small motes of light that spiraled upward and vanished. The voice returned, softer now, almost fading. "You don't have to chase me anymore, Beth. You've already caught up." "I don't want to lose this," she whispered. "Not again." You won't, the voice said gently. Everything you remember, everything you love, it's part of you now. You carry it wherever you go. That's the secret I could never explain. The light dimmed further. The door behind her began to close. Wait, but his voice was already dissolving, carried away like a breeze. Don't wait for me anymore. Just live. That's how I stay with you. And then the light went out. Beth stood in darkness for what felt like a long time, the silence deep and endless. Then slowly she opened her eyes, and she was home again. The rain still fell outside. The pocket watch rested beside her, closed now, its glow gone. But her heart felt full, so full it hurt in a way that was almost holy. She touched the watch, smiling through her tears. You always did have a flair for exits, she whispered. Outside, the rain softened, the clouds parted, revealing a clear, gentle sky. The moon hung low and pale, and for just a moment, Beth thought she saw something glint, a trail of light moving across the stars, too slow to be a ship, too fast to be a plane. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was just the night being kind. Either way, she whispered into the quiet, "Good night, Dad." The pocket watch pulsed once, one steady beat, like a final nod, and then went still. Beth sat in the silence for a while, longer, listening to the soft patter of rain easing into stillness. The world felt vast, but not lonely. She knew now that some things don't fade, they just change their shape. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, she whispered, half to herself, half to the stars, "I'll keep living, I promise." The morning after felt different, lighter somehow, as though the air itself had been quietly rearranged. Beth woke before the sun rose, a soft grey light still clinging to the horizon. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sigh of the wind against the window pane. She stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee cooling between her hands, staring at the pocket watch on the table. It no longer glowed, no longer pulsed with that quiet blue light, but she could still feel something from it. A faint warmth, like the memory of a heartbeat. It had been 3 days since she heard his voice in that in-between place, since she read his final letter. Yet it lingered, every word looping softly through her mind. "You don't have to chase me anymore." She'd repeated it so often that it began to sound like both comfort and challenge, because part of her still wanted to chase, not him, but the truth of what remained after him. The world outside was waking up, indifferent and beautiful. The first gold lines of sunlight slipped across the horizon, touching the glass of the window, turning the room to amber. Beth set the cup down and turned the pocket watch over in her hands. The engraving on the back caught the light, faint initials that hadn't been there before, RS, etched in delicate precision. It startled her. She ran her thumb over the letters. The metal was warm again. "Of course," she murmured, smiling despite the unease curling in her chest. "You're never really done, are you?" The air shifted. A single note, barely audible, resonated from the watch, soft and harmonic, as though the space around her was being tuned. Then silence. Beth exhaled slowly. "If this is another message," she said quietly, "you'd better make it count." She waited. Nothing happened. The moment stretched thin, fragile. Then, faintly, the second hand of the watch began to move backward. Beth froze. The ticking was smooth, deliberate, pulling time in reverse. The air thickened, and the light in the room dimmed, shadows bending toward the watch. She felt the same sensation she had in that starbound space, a pull, gentle but irresistible. Before she could resist, the floor tilted beneath her. The kitchen dissolved into liquid light. The world inverted. When the dizziness subsided, she stood somewhere else entirely. It was a forest, but not like any forest she'd known. The trees were tall, crystalline structures, their branches glimmering as though carved from frozen starlight. Mist coiled low around the ground, glowing faintly blue. In the air hung a quiet hum, deep and rhythmic, as though the forest itself was breathing. Beth's breath clouded in front of her. "Okay," she whispered. "This isn't Earth." Faint echo answered her, carried through the mist, a sound both mechanical and alive. She turned toward it, moving slowly between the glass-like trunks. Her footsteps made no sound. The deeper she walked, the clearer the hum became, shifting into something melodic, notes rising and falling like a coded song. Then she saw it, a machine half buried beneath a slope of glowing moss. It looked ancient, overgrown, and yet still faintly alive, a structure of curved metal and transparent panels, almost organic in its design. She approached carefully, recognizing the shape. It was a portal gate, older than any she had seen in her father's recordings, but undeniably his design. "Rick," she breathed, "you left one here too." The hum deepened as she touched the surface. The machine responded instantly, its lights flickering awake in shades of gold and blue. A voice, distant and distorted, filtered through the static. "System integrity, 47%. Reconnection possible." Beth stepped back, heart hammering. The portal gate's surface rippled like water, projecting a faint image, a memory loop. At first, it was only static. Then, shapes formed. A familiar silhouette stepped through the haze. Rick, alive, younger than she remembered, his hair unkempt, lab coat torn at the edges. His eyes darted around as if searching for something. "This place again," he muttered. Always the same starting point. He knelt near the base of the gate, adjusting a glowing panel. "If you're seeing this, Beth, it means the failsafe worked. I didn't expect you to come here, but if you did..." Beth felt her chest tighten. Rick continued, voice calm but tired. "You're standing in what's left of the origin nexus, the first test, the one that fractured everything. I left it behind for a reason, but I also knew you'd find it if you needed to. You always were better at following the real trail." He looked directly into the recording, into her. "Don't try to fix it. Just understand it. That's all I ever wanted." The image flickered, distorting, then steadied. "There's a reason the watch brought you here," he said. "It's the anchor. A bridge between what we remember and what we regret. But the bridge only holds as long as the memory does. Once it fades..." He hesitated, eyes softening. "Then I fade too." Beth's throat closed. "You're already gone," she whispered. The image flickered again. He seemed to hear her. "Not gone," he said quietly. "Just resting." The recording glitched and dissolved into light. For a long moment Beth stood in silence, the forest hum filling the air around her. Then she turned back to the gate. It pulsed faintly, waiting. The symbols carved along its rim glowed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She touched the center panel, and the portal shimmered open. Beyond it was not space, not sky, just light, pure and endless. She hesitated only a moment, then stepped through. The sensation was instant, like walking into a dream already half remembered. She found herself standing in a small room suspended in void. It was circular, walls made of glass, showing stars that bent and curved as if the universe itself were folding. In the center stood a chair. And in that chair, Rick. Not the man she knew, not exactly. This version of him looked peaceful. His eyes were closed, his body still, a faint light outlining his form. He wasn't alive, but he wasn't gone either. Something between. Beth's voice trembled. You said you were resting. He didn't open his eyes, but she felt his presence stir, a ripple of consciousness moving through the air.
I told you not to chase ghosts, he said softly, his voice inside her mind rather than through her ears. Beth stepped closer, tears threatening again. Then stop leaving doors open, a quiet chuckle echoed.
Touché. She stood beside him, hands shaking.
I saw your message.
The one in the Nexus. I know, he said.
You're always going to find it.
You don't let mystery sleep. I didn't come here to wake you up, she whispered. I just needed to know you were real, that you weren't just light. He smiled faintly. Real enough for now. Silence stretched between them. Then Beth knelt, placing the pocket watch in his open hand. It pulsed once, syncing perfectly with the light around him. You can rest now, she said softly. Rick's expression softened. Only if you promise to live the kind of life I never did. I already am. The light surrounding him began to fade, dissolving like mist under sunlight. His voice lingered, gentle as a whisper. Then this isn't goodbye.
It's just
the next chapter. The stars outside flared brilliantly, then folded inward, collapsing into darkness. When Beth opened her eyes again, she was standing back in her kitchen. Morning light streamed through the window. The pocket watch sat on the table, still, silent, but its engraving now glowed faintly. Live well. Beth smiled through her tears. She picked up the watch, held it against her chest, and whispered, I will. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint sound through the trees, a laugh quiet and familiar, fading into the distance like the last note of a song that never truly ends. For several days, Beth lived in a kind of stillness that felt both foreign and sacred. The air in the house no longer carried the weight of unspoken things. Even silence felt different now, less like absence, more like peace. Every morning she would stand by the kitchen window, the same window where she had once seen the dawn bend through her father's inventions, and watch the light spill across the floorboards in quiet golden rivers. The pocket watch sat by her coffee cup each morning, never ticking, never glowing. Yet it had become part of the ritual, a small, silent witness to everything that came next. She had begun writing again, not equations, not formulas, but memories, short fragments that drifted between dream and recollection. Sentences like, he never taught me how to fix things, only how to notice when they were broken, or sometimes love looks like distance dressed as genius. The pages stacked slowly, fragile and unfinished, but she didn't care. For once it wasn't about perfection. It was about keeping something human alive. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. Birds returned to the feeder. The neighborhood kids shouted as they biked past her porch. But at night, when the stars stretched open like old maps, Beth felt the subtle tremor of something just beyond sight.
not fear, never fear, but presence.
The kind that hummed just at the edge of consciousness. One evening, she sat by the window and whispered, "You're still here, aren't you?" No answer came, but the wind shifted slightly, brushing the curtains against her shoulder. She smiled. That's what I thought. The weeks that followed moved like gentle tides, one quiet day folding into the next. Yet somewhere in that calm rhythm, something new began to stir. It was in the way her dreams started to change. They no longer replayed memories of her father's voice or the cold glow of his lab. Instead, they showed her places she'd never been.
Worlds suspended in twilight, oceans of liquid glass, trees that grew upside down, roots tangled in the sky.
And always, at the center of each dream, there was a sound, a deep, resonant hum, like the one she'd heard in the forest where the portal gate had slept. At first, she thought it was just her mind remembering what it wanted to forget. But after the third night, she woke to find faint traces of blue dust on her hands, starlit dust, the same kind she'd brushed from the crystal trees. Beth sat up, staring at her palms in the soft moonlight.
"You've got to be kidding me," she whispered, a smile tugging at her lips. "You're really not done with me, are you?"
The pocket watch, resting on her nightstand, flickered once. It wasn't a glow, not quite, more like the reflection of light passing through a memory. She reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. "What do you want me to see this time?" No sound, no hum, just the faintest pulse of warmth beneath the surface. She closed her eyes, and the world tilted. The room dissolved around her, not with the bright violence of teleportation, but with the slow fade of a dream-changing scenes. She opened her eyes to find herself standing on a shoreline that shimmered under twin moons. The sand was metallic silver, the water still as glass, and standing near the edge, gazing out into the horizon, was a figure she knew instantly. Rick, but not as before, not as a recording, not as a ghost caught in circuitry. This Rick was solid, alive, though softened somehow. His lab coat fluttered gently in the wind. His hair was wilder, his eyes less sharp, but no less aware. When he turned, he didn't look surprised to see her. "Took you long enough," he said, voice low and amused. Beth laughed quietly.
"I was trying to let you rest." "Yeah, well, resting gets boring after a while." He gestured toward the endless water.
"Figured we could have one more talk." She walked closer until the tide touched her boots.
"This isn't real, is it?"
Rick shrugged. "Define real? We're talking, aren't we?" Beth looked around. The horizon was infinite, yet familiar. The moons hung perfectly mirrored over the sea. "You built this?" "Not exactly," he said, his voice softer now. "You did, or maybe we both did. It's what happens when you start remembering, instead of forgetting." She looked down at her reflection in the water. For a moment, she saw not herself, but the little girl who used to follow him around the lab, hands covered in ink, asking why stars were never still. The image rippled and faded back to her adult face. "You know," Rick said, breaking the quiet, "I used to think genius meant never needing anyone. Turns out that's just loneliness with better lighting." Beth's throat tightened. "You never said that before." "Didn't know how," he admitted. "You were too busy trying to understand me, and I was too busy running from what I'd already broken." She smiled faintly. "You always said emotions were distractions," he snorted.
"Yeah, well, I was an idiot sometimes."
"You might have noticed." Beth laughed softly, but the sound was threaded with sadness. "So why bring me here now?" Rick turned to face the horizon again. The sea began to glow, faint streaks of light moving beneath the surface. "Because this is the part of the story where you stop carrying my mistakes. You've already got enough of your own to make." The water brightened, the glow spreading outward like veins of light. "This place, it's yours now," he continued. "Not a lab, not a gate. Just peace. Something I never learned to keep." Beth watched the glow climb higher, stars reflecting off the tide, until sky and sea became one. "Will I see you again?" Rick hesitated, then smiled the smallest, most human smile she'd ever seen on him. "Every time you forgive me." The light swelled around them. Beth closed her eyes, feeling warmth on her skin like the sun through a window.
And then just like that, he was gone. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her bed.
The night was still, the moonlight soft. The pocket watch lay on her chest, faintly warm. She turned it over, half expecting a new engraving, but instead she found something else, a tiny fracture in the glass. Inside the crack, faint particles of light shimmered, drifting slowly like dust in sunlight. She held it close to her ear. No ticking.
Only silence.
But she understood now that silence wasn't absence. It was rest. In the days that followed, Beth found herself smiling more easily. She went for walks, long ones, where she'd whisper to the sky about things she'd never said aloud. She started building again, not portals or machines, but a small garden behind the house. She said it was for grounding, but she knew it was something else entirely. It was her way of answering him every night before bed. She would hold the pocket watch in her hands and whisper, "Good night, Dad." And though the air never moved, and no voice ever replied, the stars always seemed a little brighter when she said it. One evening, as the sun set in shades of violet and gold, Beth noticed something new sprouting in the garden. Small, silver leaves, faintly luminescent under the dusk light. They shimmered with the same quiet glow she'd seen in the Nexus forest. She knelt, touched one leaf, and felt the soft hum beneath her fingertips. A sound, ancient, familiar, rose from the soil, so low it was almost inaudible. It was the same hum she'd heard in her dreams, the same note that had once vibrated through Rick's machines. But now it wasn't metal or circuitry, it was alive. Beth smiled, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. "Guess you planted something after all." She stayed there until the last light faded, the stars blinking awake one by one. The air cooled, the hum softened, and for the first time in years, Beth felt something she hadn't known she'd lost, peace without condition. That night, as she drifted towards sleep, she thought she heard his voice, just for a moment, a whisper caught between thought and dream. "You did good, kid." She smiled in her sleep. "You too." And somewhere, in the quiet stretch between worlds,
a single light flickered and went still, not in ending,
but in rest. Morning crept slowly across the house, as if uncertain whether to disturb her. The world was quiet, suspended in that delicate space between waking and remembering. Beth lay still in bed, eyes half open, watching the slow dance of light crawl across the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of rain. Somewhere outside, a crow called once, sharp and distant, before the silence folded in again. She reached for the pocket watch on her bedside table. It was cool now, no longer warm from the night before, but when she turned it in her palm, it caught a soft, reluctant gleam. The fracture in its glass face had deepened, just slightly, like a hairline of starlight, threading through time itself. She traced it with her thumb.
"Still holding on," she whispered.
Just like me. In the days since that last dream, if it had even been a dream, Beth had learned to live slowly. She no longer chased meaning with the desperate hunger she once had. Instead, she let it drift to her in small, unguarded moments, the hum of rain on the roof, the flicker of her garden's silver leaves glowing at dusk, the sound of her own breathing in the dark. Each one felt like a message from him, not in words, but in quiet continuations. She spent that morning tending the garden. The soil was dark and rich from the rain. The silver plants had multiplied, their stems slender and luminous under the weak autumn light. When she touched them, a faint vibration pulsed beneath her fingers, almost imperceptible, but undeniably alive. It wasn't just a hum now, it was rhythm, heartbeat, continuity. She closed her eyes and smiled. For the first time in a long while, she felt content. But that night, something shifted. It began subtly, the watch ticking. Beth woke from a shallow sleep to that sound, the crisp, unmistakable rhythm of time returning. She sat up, blinking in the half-light. The pocket watch on her nightstand was moving again, its hands turning backward with deliberate grace. "No," she whispered, voice trembling between awe and fear. "You can't be doing this again." But it was. And this time, the light seeping from the crack was different, warmer, golden, almost human. The hum that followed was softer too, lower and familiar in its cadence. Rick's voice, faint and half-formed, emerged like static through a dream.
"Hey, kid," Beth froze.
The room tilted slightly, her breath catching. "Dad!" The light pulsed once in answer. "I told you," his voice murmured, more presence than sound. "Nothing ever really ends, just
loops," her heart stuttered.
I thought you were resting." "I am," he said, with that same dry warmth she remembered from her childhood. "Doesn't mean I can't drop by." Beth pressed her palms against the sheets, grounding herself in the physical world. "Why now?"
I've let you go."
"I did everything you asked." I know," he said softly. "And that's why I can talk to you like this, 'cause you're not chasing anymore. You're listening." The ticking slowed, as though syncing with her heartbeat. "Do you remember the day I left?" Rick asked. "The one you never talked about?" Beth swallowed hard.
"You mean the day you disappeared into one of your experiments and never came back?"
"Yeah," he said quietly. "That one." She looked toward the window, where the moonlight pressed against the glass like a soft hand. "I waited by the door until it got dark. You'd promised me lunch, and I kept thinking you'd come back. Mom didn't say anything, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew you wouldn't." Rick sighed, a sound that seemed to ripple through the air. "I didn't know how to stay."
"I told myself I was protecting you from me."
"But really, I just didn't know how to be ordinary." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't fall. She was too tired for anger now.
"You could have just tried." "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry."
"For everything I thought genius could excuse." Beth leaned back against her pillow, voice trembling. "Why tell me this now?" "Because," he said, "you're starting to forget the parts that hurt. And when that happens, there's room for the truth. Not the kind that justifies, but the kind that accepts." The room glowed faintly as he spoke. She could almost see him, not fully, but in shapes of light that hinted at his outline, a figure half drawn between memory and mercy. "I didn't build the watch for me," he continued.
"I built it for you."
"A map made out of time in case you ever needed to find where I'd been." Beth smiled through the ache. "You left me a breadcrumb trail through the multiverse." "Yeah," he said with a chuckle. "Guess I was sentimental after all." They sat in silence for a while, if sitting could describe what this was. She listened to the faint hum of him, the way the air shimmered slightly with his presence. "Do you ever regret it?"
she asked at last. "What, leaving?" "Everything." He didn't answer right away.
When he did, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Regret's a funny thing.
"It's not about wishing you'd done different."
It's about realizing you finally understand why you should have." Beth nodded slowly. "That sounds like something you'd say." "Probably because I'm saying it," he teased gently. "Look, Beth, you've got something I never did.
You know how to stay.
You know how to build without running."
That's your real inheritance.
"Not the science.
Not the watch."
It's the choice to stay." She closed her eyes, letting his words settle into her like light sinking into deep water. "Then maybe I can forgive both of us." That's all I ever wanted. The glow began to fade. The ticking slowed until it stopped. "Wait," Beth said suddenly, heart racing. "Don't go yet." "I'm not," he said quietly.
"I'm just..."
Changing form again.
"That's what time does. That's what love does too." She could barely see him now.
Only feel the warmth lingering where his presence had been. "Promise me one thing," he murmured. "Anything. When the watch finally stops, really stops, don't try to fix it. Just let it rest. Promise me that." Beth nodded.
"I promise." The air grew still.
The light folded in on itself, curling softly into the watch, then silence. She sat there for a long time, staring at the motionless piece of metal in her palm. The room was ordinary again. The rain had stopped. A faint smell of earth drifted through the open window. Beth whispered, "Good night, Dad." No response came, only the sound of her own breath and the faint drip of water from the eaves. But somehow that was enough. Over the next few weeks the garden grew wild. The silver leaves multiplied, reaching higher, brighter, until they shimmered like stars on earth. She didn't try to control it. She simply let it grow. People in town began to ask questions, what kind of plant it was, how it glowed. Beth only smiled and said, "Something from an old memory." Sometimes, late at night, She'd stand among those glowing leaves, the soft hum rising around her like music, and though she never heard his voice again, she could feel the echo of it in the wind. One evening, when the stars burned clear and close, Beth noticed the pocket watch glowing faintly again, only this time it wasn't ticking or pulsing. The crack in its glass had sealed itself, and inside, where the gears should have been, there was only light, pure, unmoving, eternal. She lifted it to her ear and listened. No ticking, no hum, just silence, and the deep peace that came with knowing some stories don't end. They dissolve gently into everything else. Beth set the watch on her bedside table, smiled to herself, and whispered one last time, "Thanks for the time, old man," and as she drifted into sleep, she felt something warm brush her shoulder, a touch that was neither dream nor memory, but both, somewhere far beyond the stars.
A light flickered once
And stayed. The days after the light faded carried a stillness that felt almost sacred. Beth moved through her house as if walking through the remains of a song, the kind whose echo lingers long after the music stops. The air held a different weight now, softer somehow, as though time itself had exhaled. The pocket watch remained on her bedside table. It no longer glowed or ticked, but it didn't feel dead. Instead, it seemed content, complete. Every morning she'd glance at it, expecting motion, expecting the shimmer to return, but nothing ever happened.
and that was okay.
The silence of it was a kind of peace she hadn't known before. One afternoon, a knock at the door startled her. She hadn't had visitors in months. When she opened it, the autumn wind rushed past, carrying the scent of cold leaves and faint electricity. On the porch stood Morty, older now, face lined in quiet ways that told stories of worlds visited and left behind. "Hey, Aunt Beth," he said, trying for a smile but landing somewhere near hesitation.
Hope I'm not interrupting anything.
"Cosmic," Beth laughed softly.
Not today. Come in! Morty stepped inside, his eyes flicking across the room as if expecting ghosts. Smells the same, he said.
Like soldering metal and garden soil. She raised an eyebrow.
That's oddly specific.
He shrugged. "It's a Smith family thing. You always remember the mix of chaos and comfort." They sat by the window where the garden outside shimmered faintly with silver leaves. Morty leaned forward, staring at them like someone looking through time.
So, he really did it, didn't he? Found a way to leave traces. Beth nodded. Not in the way you'd think. There's no machine, no coordinates, just resonance. Morty smiled faintly. Grandpa Rick and his poetic loopholes?
Guess even the smartest man in the multiverse couldn't resist making an afterlife out of equations. Beth studied him. "You miss him?" Morty's eyes softened. "Every day, but not like before. It's weird, he's gone, but I keep finding pieces of him in places I never noticed. The way light bends around a portal, the pause before a joke, even in the silence. It's like he taught the universe his laugh before he left." Beth looked out the window. "That's exactly how it feels." For a while, they sat without speaking. The silver plants swayed gently in the breeze, their glow pulsing like distant stars breathing in rhythm. Morty finally turned toward the table and noticed the watch. "Is that—" "Yes," Beth said quietly. He reached for it, but stopped halfway, uncertain.
Does it still, do anything? Beth shook her head. No, not anymore. Morty exhaled, a sound between relief and regret. He once told me time wasn't supposed to heal, it was supposed to reveal. I never understood that. Maybe that's because you were still trying to fix it, Beth said.
He spent his whole life breaking time open to see what was inside. I think he finally found out. Morty leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "You think he's somewhere?" Beth smiled faintly. "Somewhere isn't the right word. He's in the pause between seconds, in the hum of the stars. Maybe he's the reason time keeps moving. Morty let the thought settle. You sound like him. Maybe I finally understand him. The wind shifted outside, carrying the whisper of rain. The room dimmed slightly, the air trembling as if a storm were deciding whether to form. Morty glanced toward the watch again. And then something happened. The faintest vibration pulsed through the air, almost imperceptible but enough to make the glass on the table ring softly. The watch flickered once, not glowing, but responding, like it had heard its name spoken across dimensions. Beth frowned. Did you feel that? Morty nodded slowly. Yeah, like feedback. A low hum filled the air, familiar yet altered, softer than before, no longer a call from beyond but an answer from within. The watch's hands trembled, then aligned perfectly at 12. Beth stood, heart racing. It's never done that before. Morty's expression hardened. Not fear, but focus. Maybe it's reacting to us. To you. She shook her head. It shouldn't. He said when it stops, I'm supposed to let it rest. Yeah, well, Morty muttered. Rick never did like following his own advice. The hum deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. The air thickened, charged with static memory. Morty stepped closer, his voice a whisper. Do you hear it? Beth nodded. It wasn't just a sound. It was language woven into vibration, a pattern she could almost understand, like a heartbeat echoing from a place where time had folded in on itself. Then as suddenly as it began, everything stilled. The hum stopped. The air cleared. The watch returned to silence. Beth exhaled. Maybe it was just a final ripple. Morty looked at her, then at the garden. No, I think it was a handoff. She blinked. What do you mean? He pointed toward the window. Outside, the silver plants were shifting. Their leaves weren't just swaying. They were growing, rearranging themselves into a spiral that mirrored the same symbol engraved on the watch's back. A soft light pulsed from the center of the spiral, glowing through the mist. It wasn't blinding, just steady, calm, alive. Beth whispered, He's connecting something. Morty grinned. Of course he is. Rick Sanchez doesn't do endings. He does continuations. Beth stepped outside, barefoot on the wet grass. The glow enveloped her in soft luminescence. Every breath she took felt charged with memory. The plants seemed to move with purpose now, their hum rising like a choir of silent frequencies. Morty followed her, squinting into the light. It's beautiful. Beth knelt beside the center of the spiral. In the soil, something metallic glimmered, a seed, or perhaps a fragment. She reached out and touched it. It was warm. Suddenly she understood. The garden wasn't just alive, it was evolving. Rick hadn't left her a grave. He'd left her a system, one still growing, still learning. This is what he meant, she whispered. Not an afterlife, a continuation of mind. Morty's eyes widened. You mean he uploaded himself? Not entirely, Beth said. More like imprinted. He let his thoughts dissolve into patterns, frequencies, organisms. He didn't cheat death, he translated it. Morty laughed softly. That sounds exactly like him. Beth turned the pocket watch in her hand. The light from the garden reflected in its surface, making it look alive again. Then maybe he's not gone at all, just redistributed. They stood together in the growing glow. The garden swayed in rhythm like an ocean made of stars. Above them, the clouds parted, revealing a night sky so clear it felt unreal. Morty looked up. Do you think he's watching? Beth smiled faintly. No, I think he's participating. For a long time, they said nothing. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full. Full of what had been, what was, and what might still be. Finally, Morty sighed. You gonna keep the garden? Beth nodded. It's part of him now, part of everything. Morty gave her a small smile. Then I guess this isn't goodbye. It's just another version of hello. Beth touched his shoulder gently. That's exactly what he'd say. They watched until dawn crept over the horizon, washing the silver plants in gold. When the sun finally touched the spiral's center, the light dimmed naturally, folding back into the earth like a completed equation. Beth turned the pocket watch one last time. Its glass was clear now. No cracks, no marks, just reflection. She could see both of them in it, standing in the new light, surrounded by the quiet hum of something greater than understanding. She closed the lid, smiling through tears she didn't need to hide. Goodbye, Dad, she said softly. Or, hello. The wind stirred, carrying a faint laugh across the fields. Morty's eyes widened. Did you hear that? Beth nodded, smiling. Yeah, he always loved a dramatic exit. And as the morning light spread across the garden, the hum returned, not loud, not commanding, but steady, like the heartbeat of a universe learning to breathe again. Time, at last, had found its rhythm. The days unfolded quietly after the spiral sank back into the soil. The hum that once filled the garden had mellowed into something subtler, an almost imperceptible vibration in the air, a faint rhythm that accompanied the wind. Beth could feel it under her skin, especially at night, when the house was still, and every sound felt closer, like the world itself was breathing softly beside her. She had begun tending to the garden differently now. It wasn't about keeping it alive anymore, it was about listening. She watered not out of duty, but out of conversation. Every leaf seemed to respond, tilting slightly toward her hands, as though understanding. Sometimes she'd speak aloud to the soil, her voice barely more than a whisper. She never expected answers, but she always felt heard. Morty visited often after that. Not for answers, he'd had his share of those, but for quiet. He'd helped prune the silver-leaved plants, making careful snips while humming tunelessly. It reminded Beth of her father in his workshop, murmuring formulas under his breath like lullabies for atoms. The resemblance was almost haunting, yet comforting too. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the half-open blinds, Morty said, "You ever wonder what he'd say if he could see us now?" Beth smiled faintly. "I think he'd call us sentimental idiots, and then secretly feel proud." Morty laughed, then fell quiet, watching the light scatter over the watch resting on the windowsill. "Do you think he planned all of this? The garden, the watch, everything?" Beth thought for a moment before answering. Rick never planned things in the way normal people do. He didn't write endings, he just built doorways. Maybe this is one of them. Maybe he wanted us to find peace in a world that never stopped shifting. Morty nodded slowly. Yeah. He used to say the universe was like a badly tuned song. Maybe this was his way of fixing one note. Beth looked at him thoughtfully. Or maybe it was his way of teaching us to live with the dissonance. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It shimmered. The air outside the window quivered, as if some invisible chord had been struck, resonating across memory. That night, Beth dreamed again. She was standing in the old garage, the one filled with blueprints, wires, and glass flasks that hummed when no one touched them. Everything was dimly lit by a golden light that didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular. The air smelled like solder and rain. At the far end of the room, Rick stood with his back to her, adjusting something on a table that pulsed softly like a living heart made of glass. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, without turning. Beth's voice wavered. "Neither are you," he chuckled. "Touché." She took a cautious step forward.
Why did you do it, Dad?
"The watch, the garden, the codes."
Couldn't you have just stayed?
He sighed, still not looking at her.
You think it's about staying?
Beth, the universe doesn't stop moving just because you love it. It spins, it breaks, it rebuilds. You either flow with it or get torn apart trying to freeze it in place. She swallowed hard. "And what am I supposed to do with what you left behind?" He finally turned toward her. His eyes weren't glowing or supernatural. They were tired, deeply human, and yet soft in a way she'd never seen before. "You don't do anything with it?" he said quietly.
You just live alongside it, like a melody you hum but never try to capture. Beth felt something ache deep inside her chest.
"You could have told me that when you were alive." Rick smirked faintly. "Would you have listened?" Her tears came before she could stop them. Probably not. Then we both learned something. The silence between them thickened. The heart-like machine on the table flickered with a warm pulse that matched the beat of her breath. Beth stepped closer. "So this is what you became?" Rick looked down at it. "Partly. The rest
Scattered.
Think of me as a whisper in the code, a residue in the pattern. You don't have to find me. I'm already threaded through everything you touch." Her throat tightened. "That's not the same." He gave a slow nod.
No, but it's what's left.
"And sometimes that's enough." The light began to fade from the room. Rick's outline blurred like smoke folding back into itself. "Wait," she whispered. "Don't go yet." His voice was calm, almost tender.
Beth, I never really leave.
"Not when someone remembers to ask the right kind of silence." And then he was gone. The garage dimmed, the hum faded, and Beth woke with tears drying on her cheeks and a faint vibration in her chest. She sat up, staring into the dark. The watch on her nightstand pulsed once, softly, like a heartbeat. The next morning, the garden was different. The spiral pattern had deepened into the earth, as if it was slowly sinking towards something unseen. New shoots had sprouted overnight, transparent, almost crystalline, shimmering in shades of blue instead of silver. When sunlight hit them, the light refracted into fine, trembling lines across the air, as though invisible strings were being plucked. Morty arrived not long after, his eyes widening. "Whoa, okay, that's new." Beth knelt beside the new growth.
It's evolving.
"Maybe it's responding to us again." Morty crouched beside her. "Or maybe it's trying to show us something." They waited, neither speaking. The garden hummed faintly, the kind of frequency you feel in your bones more than you hear. Slowly, the refracted light lines began to converge, meeting at a single point in the center of the spiral. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The air stilled. The glow vanished. Beth frowned. "What was that?" Morty tilted his head.
Maybe it's sinking.
"Like the last part of the program loading?" Beth smiled softly. "You really are his grandson," he grinned. "Genetics or trauma? Hard to say." As the sun began to set, Beth sat alone on the porch while Morty packed his things. The silver-blue glow of the plants lit the evening like a dream in motion. She could almost feel Rick's presence in the air, a quiet kind of pride, like the smile of someone watching from just beyond sight. She spoke softly, almost to the wind. "If you're still here, thank you. Not for what you did, but for what you allowed me to see." The leaves rustled. A single droplet of water rolled off one and landed in her palm. It shimmered faintly before fading away, leaving a tiny warmth behind. Later that night, Beth stood by her window, looking at the moon hanging low over the quiet neighborhood. The watch rested on her bedside table again, still and calm. But when the moonlight hit its surface, something inside it reflected, not light, but memory. A fleeting image of Rick in his lab, smiling faintly, then fading away like dust in reverse. Beth whispered, "Good night, Dad." The air stirred. Somewhere in the distance, a faint laugh rippled through the quiet. Soft, weightless, familiar. Beth lay down, feeling the hum of the garden beneath her floorboards, deep and steady like the pulse of time itself. She thought about all the things she'd learned, not from equations or machines, but from loss, love, and the spaces in between them. Maybe that was what Rick had been trying to show her all along. That the smallest acts, listening, forgiving, remembering, were the real experiments, and that even geniuses longed for peace in the end. As sleep began to claim her, she thought she heard a final whisper, not from the garden, not from the watch, but from somewhere inside her own thoughts. See? You figured it out. And for the first time in her life, Beth didn't feel the need to reply. She simply smiled and drifted quietly into dreams that felt less like escape and more like home. The hum deepened one last time,
resonating through the walls, through the earth,
through everything that had ever been touched by his hands. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a continuation. Morning came quietly, draped in a thin veil of mist that softened every sound. The world outside Beth's window looked half-dreamed, like it was still deciding whether to wake or rest a little longer. The silver-blue garden swayed in slow motion, its leaves carrying beads of dew that shimmered as if the sky had sprinkled tiny stars across the earth. Beth stood at the window for a long time, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. She didn't drink it anymore. She just liked the warmth, the ritual, the small gravity of habit that kept her anchored between yesterday and forever. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. It wasn't Rick's pocket watch, but its sound reminded her of him in a gentler way, less invention, more heartbeat. As she turned toward the garden, she noticed something different. The spiral wasn't visible anymore. Overnight, it had dissolved into a seamless carpet of living light. Every blade of grass shimmered faintly with silver veins, connecting into a delicate network that pulsed in rhythm.
It was beautiful, yes, but there was something more. It felt
complete. Beth stepped outside, her bare feet pressing into the cool earth. The hum she'd come to know greeted her like an old friend. She knelt, touched the ground, and whispered, "You've finished, haven't you?" The hum deepened slightly as though answering. She smiled, tears pricking her eyes. "Then I guess this is your way of saying goodbye." A soft wind brushed through her hair, carrying the faintest scent of ozone and old metal, the unmistakable scent of her father's workshop. For a moment, she could almost hear him muttering under his breath, his voice drifting through equations and laughter and regret. But instead of sorrow, Beth felt peace. That afternoon, Morty arrived again. His eyes were tired, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder.
"Hey," he said, voice softer than usual.
"Heard the garden's glowing again," Beth chuckled. "It never really stopped." Morty stepped closer, scanning the luminous field.
"It's like..."
"It's breathing." "Maybe it's saying something," Beth replied. Morty crouched, brushing his fingers across the silver grass. "Feels warm," Beth nodded. "It's alive in a way we don't have words for. But it's not meant to last."
"I think it's fading,"
he finished. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Evolving." They stood together for a while, saying nothing. The light shifted subtly, casting slow waves of color that rolled across the garden like memories turning themselves inside out. After a while, Morty exhaled.
"You know, I used to think he'd never stop running from everything."
"But now it's like he found a way to stay still without disappearing." Beth smiled. "He didn't stop running. He just changed direction." Morty tilted his head. "Meaning?" "Meaning he stopped chasing the stars and started becoming one." Morty's mouth twitched upward. "He'd hate how poetic that sounds." "I know," she said.
"That's why I said it." The wind stirred again.
The shimmer across the garden rippled outward, reaching the fence, the porch, the air itself. The whole world seemed to lean in for a moment, listening, Morty looked uneasy. Is it supposed to do that? Beth shook her head, her eyes distant.
No, it's not supposed to do anything.
That's the beauty of it. She stepped forward into the center of the light. The hum grew louder, not harsh, not mechanical, but warm, like 1,000 heartbeats aligning. Morty called after her, "Beth, wait!" But she didn't stop. She placed her hands gently against the air, where the spiral used to be, and the light responded, opening like a slow inhale. Shapes flickered within it, circles, lines, strands of golden energy twisting together in patterns that felt achingly familiar. She turned slightly, her voice steady. "He's closing the loop," Morty frowned. "What loop?"
The one he started the day he left.
"The one that kept the two of us wondering." As she spoke, a shape began to form in the light, a silhouette, faint and wavering, like smoke shaped by memory. Morty took a step forward, then froze. It was Rick, not quite solid, not quite spirit. His outline shimmered, his eyes soft for once, his grin smaller, but truer. He looked older, but also lighter, as if he'd shed everything heavy except love. "Dad," Beth whispered. Morty's voice cracked. "Grandpa?" Rick's image flickered, his voice carried by the hum. "Hey, you two."
Look at you, still sentimental.
"Guess some traits really are hereditary." Beth laughed through a tear.
You couldn't just leave quietly, could you?
"Quiet's overrated," he replied. "Besides, had to make sure you weren't turning my garden into some kind of existential therapy circle." Morty smiled shakily. "We might have done that already," Rick smirked. "Yeah, figured." His tone softened. "You did good, both of you." Beth stepped closer. "So what is this, Dad?"
Another hologram? A backup consciousness?
Rick shook his head gently. "Nah, just a residue."
A wave still bouncing around.
"Every equation leaves an echo if you listen long enough." Beth swallowed. "So this is the last one?" Rick's eyes met hers. "Does it matter?" She smiled faintly.
No, I guess not. For a few seconds, none of them spoke.
The light pulsed softly, syncing with their breathing. It felt less like conversation and more like communion, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Rick's voice came again, lower now. "I spent my life thinking genius meant control. Turns out it meant surrender."
Took me way too long to figure that out. Beth felt her chest tighten. Oh, you could have told me that sooner. He smiled sadly.
"I wasn't ready to mean it sooner." Morty wiped his eyes. "So to what happens now?" Rick looked around, his expression wistful. "Now you live. You screw up. You love people anyway.
You forgive yourself.
You keep building things that make no sense until they start to—"
That's all there ever was, Beth nodded slowly. And you?
Rick's grin softened. "I think I finally get to rest." The light flickered, dimming around him. The shape of him began to dissolve into particles, drifting upward like sparks from a dying fire. Beth whispered, "Goodbye." Rick's voice floated back, faint but steady. "Nah, let's stick with see you later." Then the light went out. The hum faded into silence. The garden's glow retreated gently, leaving only the faint, silver shimmer of moonlight on ordinary leaves. Everything that had once pulsed with cosmic life now looked perfectly, beautifully human. Beth and Morty stood there for a long time, neither speaking. The air felt lighter, the silence kind. Finally, Morty sighed.
He really did it, didn't he? Found peace? Beth nodded.
"And somehow he left a piece of it here." Morty smiled faintly. "Guess we should take care of it." Beth looked up at the stars. "We already are." They stood together beneath the fading light, the hum of the earth quiet but still present, woven deep into everything around them. It no longer needed to be loud to be real. When Morty finally left that night, Beth remained outside, sitting in the grass. The moonlight pooled around her like spilled milk, soft and forgiving. She could feel the pulse of the garden beneath her palms, a slow, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of something vast and at peace. She took a deep breath, and for the first time in her life, it didn't hurt to exhale. A shooting star streaked across the horizon, faint and slow, as if the universe itself was waving goodbye. Or perhaps, hello, Beth smiled softly to herself. I'll take either. She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and walked back toward the house. The watch on the table caught the moonlight and glimmered once, briefly, tenderly, before settling back into stillness. Inside, the air was calm. The ticking clock in the hallway marked the passing of time without urgency. Everything was as it should be. Beth sat on her bed, looking out the window one last time. The garden was dark now, but she didn't need its glow to know it was alive. Thanks for everything, Dad, she whispered, for teaching me that endings aren't real. The night answered her in silence, the kind of silence that listens. And as her eyes grew heavy, she smiled faintly. Somewhere, she thought, maybe in another thread of the multiverse, her father was smiling too. The hum beneath her floorboards returned once more, softer than breath, slower than sleep. It wasn't a call, it was a lullaby. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of morning that didn't demand to be noticed. Soft light filtered through the curtains, pale and forgiving, spreading across the wooden floorboards of Beth's room like a slow, tender wave. For a few minutes she lay still, caught between the dream and the day. Her hand brushed against the watch on her bedside table, its weight familiar but different now, lighter somehow,
as though it had been forgiven of all its history. When she finally rose, the house felt awake before she was.
The air carried the faint scent of rain, though the sky outside was clear. Somewhere a bird sang a slow, uncertain tune. She followed the sound down the hallway and paused by the door that led to the garden. The silver glow was gone. What remained was something gentler, a patch of living green, dappled with sunlight and dew. The spiral had vanished completely, leaving behind a pattern so subtle it could only be seen if one knew where to look. Beth knelt, running her fingers over the grass. It pulsed faintly beneath her touch, quietly, obediently alive. Still here, she whispered. Just quieter now. She sat back on her heels and closed her eyes. A faint hum brushed the edge of hearing, less sound, more memory. She smiled. For the rest of the morning, Beth busied herself with small things, washing the dishes, watering the few plants that remained on the porch, sketching aimless lines in her old notebook. The house had always felt like a machine missing one essential piece, but now it breathed with her, steady and unhurried. Around noon, she heard the sound of gravel crunching outside. Morty's voice followed, calling softly. "Hey, Beth." She opened the door and smiled. He looked different, less restless, more grounded, maybe even older. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted.
Kept thinking about
"Everything." Beth gestured for him to come in. "Coffee?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, black, just like Grandpa." She smiled faintly as she poured. He'd be proud. Morty took the cup, staring into it for a while before saying, "You think he's really gone?" Beth leaned against the counter, her expression unreadable. "Gone isn't the right word." Morty looked up. "Then what is?" "Dispersed," she said. "Integrated."
Pick your metaphor, but gone? No, you don't erase a mind like that, you just...
Change its frequency. Morty nodded slowly.
So he's everywhere, in a way, Beth said softly.
In everything that listens. They drank in silence for a few moments. The clock ticked steadily behind them, each sound a small pulse of the world continuing. Then Morty said, "You know, I've been thinking about leaving again."
Not forever, just traveling.
"Seeing what else is out there." Beth looked up, surprised but not disappointed. "You mean the multiverse?" He shook his head. "No, just Earth, the regular one." "I think I've had enough dimensions for a while," she smiled. "Good choice." Morty's expression softened. "You could come, you know. You don't have to stay here." Beth looked out the window. The garden shimmered faintly in the sunlight, peaceful and complete.
"I think I do," she said. "At least for now."
"Something tells me the story here isn't finished yet." Morty followed her gaze.
You think he left something else behind? Maybe not a thing, she murmured.
Maybe a message. They went outside together, standing at the edge of the grass. The air was warm, heavy with quiet meaning. Morty crouched down, tracing the faint path of where the spiral once had been.
It's weird.
When I touch it, it feels like static, but not random.
Like there's a pattern underneath, Beth nodded.
There always is. Do you think it's trying to say something? Maybe it already did, she said. We just haven't learned the language yet. Morty sat back, exhaling slowly. I used to think Grandpa's genius was about breaking the rules, but now I think it was about listening to what couldn't be heard. Beth smiled faintly. That's what I mean by evolution. A gust of wind swept through the garden, stirring the trees. The light shifted, scattering through the leaves like liquid glass. For a brief moment, the air seemed to vibrate with a resonance both subtle and immense. Beth and Morty froze, sensing it. Then they heard it, a faint sound, not quite a voice, not quite a vibration, just a note, low and clear, echoing from nowhere. Morty whispered, "Did you hear that?" Beth nodded.
Yes, what was it?
She smiled, tears filling her eyes. A laugh. The sound faded quickly, leaving the air still again. Morty looked shaken, but there was wonder in his expression. Beth placed a hand on his shoulder. "He's not gone, Morty. He's just quieter now." They stayed there until the light shifted toward evening, watching the world settle into itself. The hum of existence carried a softness neither of them had noticed before. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind, felt like part of a larger pattern, one that was no longer trying to impress, only to be. As dusk approached, Morty stood. "I should go," he said.
If I don't leave now, I'll change my mind.
Beth smiled. "That's not always a bad thing." He grinned faintly. "Yeah, but I think Grandpa would tell me to keep moving."
He hated when I stayed still too long, she laughed quietly.
"He'd say motion keeps the math alive," Morty nodded. "Exactly." He hesitated at the gate, looking back at her.
Beth, thanks.
"For helping me understand him. I don't think I ever really did before." "You still don't," she said gently. "But you're closer," he chuckled. "That's something at least." Beth watched as he walked down the path, his figure slowly disappearing into the fading light. When he was gone, she turned back toward the garden. The sky had begun to darken, stars blinking into view one by one. She sat in the grass, folding her legs beneath her, and looked up. The night was clear. No spirals, no rifts, no anomalies, just a sky full of honest stars. For a long time, she said nothing. The world felt enormous and intimate all at once. Somewhere in the spaces between light and silence, she could almost hear her father's voice again, soft, amused, irreverent. "Don't get sentimental, kid," it said. "Just keep building," she smiled, whispering, "I will." The wind moved through the trees, carrying her promise into the darkness. Later that night, she found herself back inside, the watch still glinting faintly where it lay. She picked it up, turning it over in her hand. There was an engraving she hadn't noticed before, small, almost invisible. Etched beneath the backplate, it read, "If you found peace."
You've already solved it, Beth laughed quietly, a tear escaping down her cheek.
"Of course you'd turn it into a riddle," she said. The watch ticked once, just once, and then went still. Beth set it back down, exhaling. "Good night, Dad." Outside, the garden shimmered faintly in the moonlight. The pattern had vanished, but its pulse remained, woven into the soil, the air, the rhythm of all things. The hum was no longer a call from beyond. It was the sound of life continuing, endlessly folding and unfolding itself. As she drifted towards sleep, Beth felt a quiet joy beneath the sorrow, a realization that the story wasn't about Rick's disappearance, or even his peace. It was about the echo that remained, the proof that connection doesn't die when the voice does. The house sighed gently, wood creaking like an old friend settling into comfort. In her dreams, Beth saw the spiral one last time, not glowing, not cosmic, just drawn into the dust of a workshop floor, and beside it,
A single message written in chalk, fading but legible. Don't mourn the silence.
"You're part of the sound now." She reached for it, and the dream folded softly around her like a blanket. When dawn came again, the house was still. The garden waited, quiet and infinite. Somewhere far beyond, perhaps in another version of the same sky, a familiar laugh echoed briefly before dissolving into the hum of creation. Everything, at last, was home. The night was clear, endless, and heavy with stillness. Beth sat at her desk, a single lamp casting a warm halo over scattered blueprints, notes, and pieces of old machinery that hadn't been touched in years. The quiet was familiar now, no longer a void but a companion. The watch ticked faintly beside her, its steady rhythm the pulse of a house that finally knew peace. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. For days she had been sketching, not out of necessity, but instinct. The lines were abstract, spirals, intersecting rings, and something that resembled a bridge made of light. She didn't understand what it meant yet. She wasn't sure she needed to. The clock struck midnight. Outside, the garden shimmered faintly beneath a sky full of unblinking stars. The spiral was gone, but sometimes when the wind moved just right, she thought she could still see the faint outline of its path. Tonight, that outline pulsed again, barely visible, but undeniably alive. Beth rose and went to the window. "What are you trying to show me now?" she murmured. The watch ticked louder just once, as though in response. She grabbed her coat and stepped into the night. The air was sharp, cool, and electric, the kind of air that hummed with potential. The grass was wet beneath her feet, and the soil radiated faint warmth. She walked toward the center of where the spiral had once glowed. The faint hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through her bones. She closed her eyes. For a moment, everything else fell away, the wind, the world, even her breath. There was only the pulse, rhythmic and deep. And then she heard it.
A voice. Not from above or within, but everywhere. Still listening?
Her eyes opened, wide and wet.
"Dad?" Silence.
Then faint laughter, softer than memory. Beth smiled through tears. "You couldn't resist, could you?" The voice was more vibration than sound, threading through her thoughts like current. "You didn't bury me, Beth. You tuned me." She laughed quietly, half in disbelief, half in recognition. "Always the scientist even now, always the father too," she froze. The air shimmered faintly around her. Shapes began to flicker at the edges of her vision, soft outlines, patterns of light folding inward, forming and dissolving in the space between moments. The spiral was returning, not in silver this time, but in gold, pulsing gently, growing wider with each breath. Beth took a step back, her heart racing. "What is this?" "You call it memory. I call it architecture." The golden lines coiled and rose, weaving through the night like strands of living data. They stretched upward, connecting sky to soil, infinite but intimate. She reached out.
"You built this after?"
Before, during, after, the order doesn't matter. It never did. The words vibrated through her chest like music. For a moment she felt everything, the years of anger, wonder, grief, all dissolving into something pure. "You said you wanted peace," she whispered.
"Is this it?" A pause.
And peace was never the goal.
Understanding was. The spiral pulsed faster, brighter.
Forming a pattern she had only ever seen once before, in the diagrams she and Rick had drawn when she was a child, the ones he'd said she was too young to understand. "You left it for me," she said. "All of this. You knew I'd find it. I didn't leave it," the voice murmured. "We built it together. You just didn't know yet." Beth felt her knees weaken. The realization hit like dawn breaking after centuries of dark. This wasn't just his work, it was hers, reflected back through time, through memory, through love disguised as logic. Then what happens now? She asked softly. Now you build what I couldn't. The golden spiral lifted higher, its glow spreading across the garden, lighting the trees, the house, the sky. The air shimmered with fractal light, forming symbols that twisted and merged into complex, fluid shapes. Beth's hand trembled as she lifted it toward the center of the spiral. The moment her fingers brushed the light, warmth flooded her body, not burning, but awakening. Every image, every invention, every argument she'd ever had with her father played behind her eyes.
His laughter,
His brilliance, his loneliness, the sound of his tools, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, and then softly, his final words. Don't mourn the silence. You're part of the sound now. Tears streamed down her face.
I hear it, she whispered. I hear you. Good. Then listen closely. The spiral began to fold inward, collapsing not with destruction, but with grace.
The light gathered at its center, forming a single orb, small, bright, pulsing like a heartbeat. Beth reached out again, and the orb hovered before her palm, radiating warmth. Every frequency needs resonance, the voice said.
You are mine, her breath caught.
And you are mine. For a moment, the air seemed to hum in perfect alignment. The world, the stars, her heartbeat, all synchronized. Then, with a gentle flicker, the orb dissolved into light, streaming into her chest. Beth gasped, stumbling slightly as the warmth spread through her veins. It wasn't painful. It was connection pure and infinite. The hum deepened inside her, becoming something steady, something alive. When she opened her eyes again, the garden was dark. The golden spiral was gone, replaced by a faint shimmer across the grass. But she could still feel it, the pulse beneath the soil, matching her own. She stood there for a long while, watching the stars. For the first time in years, the sky looked closer, like it was leaning down to listen. Inside, the lamp still burned on her desk. The blueprints waited, lines half-drawn, equations unsolved. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to draw again. Not from memory this time, but from knowing. Her hand moved steadily, guided by something beyond logic. Circles within circles, pathways that folded back into themselves, systems that weren't mechanical, but organic, alive. When she finished the first sheet, she realized she wasn't designing a machine. She was designing a bridge, a resonance between worlds, between minds, between what was and what could be. The watch on the table ticked once more, then stopped completely. The silence it left behind wasn't emptiness, it was completion. Beth smiled faintly.
I'll take it from here. She leaned back, gazing at her work.
The shapes pulsed faintly under the lamplight, as though they were already breathing. She could feel her father there, not as a ghost, but as part of the rhythm, part of her own heartbeat. Outside, dawn began to bloom across the horizon. The mist glowed pale gold, carrying the faint hum of the soil upward like a song. Beth stood at the window, the first rays of morning brushing her face. She closed her eyes. "Good morning, Dad," she whispered. And somewhere beyond sound, beyond light, a quiet voice answered. Warm, amused, eternal. "About time you woke up." The wind stirred the trees, and the hum of the garden joined the sunrise. Beth smiled, breathing in the golden air, the pulse of everything her father had left behind, and everything she was about to build.